At 73 years old, Margaret Thompson never imagined she would be standing backstage at a popular television talent show. Her hands, weathered by time, trembled slightly as she adjusted her simple blue dress. The production assistant had just told her she would be on stage in 5 minutes, and she could hear the host making jokes to warm up the audience. Margaret clutched her worn leather purse tighter. She knew exactly why they had brought her here. It wasn't because they believed in her talent. It was because they thought an old woman trying to play piano would be funny. A joke. Entertainment for millions. But Margaret had a secret they didn't know about. "Mrs. Thompson? You're up next," the young assistant said, his tone professionally polite but distant. Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thank you, dear." As she walked toward the stage, memories flooded back. 60 years ago, she had been Maria Margarita Petrovsky, one of the most promising young pianists in Eastern Europe. Concert halls across Prague and Vienna had been filled with people who came just to hear her play. But then life took unexpected turns. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice boomed through the speakers, "our next contestant is something special. Please welcome 73-year-old Margaret Thompson." The audience clapped politely, but Margaret could hear the confused murmurs. Some people were already pulling out their phones, ready to record what they expected would be a disaster. "So, Margaret," the host began, his smile too bright, too fake, "I heard you play piano at your local retirement home. That must be nice." The audience chuckled. Margaret kept her face calm, though inside her heart was racing. "Yes, I play for my friends there," she replied simply. "And what brings you to our show today? Looking for your 15 minutes of fame?" The host winked at the camera, encouraging more laughter. Margaret thought about the real reason. Her granddaughter Emily had secretly submitted her application. Emily was the only one who knew about Margaret's past, the only one who still believed in her grandmother's gift. "I suppose I just wanted to play for a bigger audience one more time," Margaret said softly. "Well, we have a beautiful grand piano right here for you." The host gestured dramatically. "What will you be playing for us? Perhaps, Mary Had a Little Lamb?" More laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret saw young people in the front row already typing on their phones, probably posting about the cute old lady who was about to embarrass herself. "Actually," Margaret said, walking slowly to the piano bench, "I thought I'd play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. The host's smile froze. The laughter died instantly. Even the camera crew seemed to pause. Rachmaninoff? That's quite ambitious for someone of your experience level," the host stammered. Margaret sat down at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument was magnificent, far better than the old upright at the retirement home. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the feel of the keys transport her back to her youth. "Perhaps we should start with something simpler?" the host suggested nervously. He glanced offstage where the producers were frantically gesturing. But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She positioned her hands and began to play. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece filled the theater. Complex, powerful, and perfectly executed. Margaret's fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. In the audience, jaws dropped. The young man in the front row who had been texting lowered his phone, his eyes wide. A professional musician in the third row leaned forward, recognizing the extraordinary skill being displayed. As Margaret played, the years seemed to melt away. She was no longer a 73-year-old grandmother. She was Maria Margarita, the young prodigy who had once brought audiences to tears with her performances. Her body swayed with the music, her face showing every emotion the piece demanded. The host stood frozen at the side of the stage. Behind him, the producers watched in stunned silence. This wasn't what they had planned. They had brought her here as a joke, a brief comedy segment before the real acts. But what they were witnessing was pure artistry. Margaret moved into the most challenging section of the piece, her hands creating a storm of notes that filled every corner of the theater. The audience sat in complete silence, mesmerized. Some had tears in their eyes. Others gripped their armrests, overwhelmed by the unexpected beauty of the moment. As she played, Margaret remembered why she had given it all up. The communist regime in her homeland. The escape to America with nothing but the clothes on her back. The years of working in factories and restaurants to support her family. The piano had become a distant dream, something she could only return to in stolen moments. But she had never stopped practicing. Every morning before dawn, she would play on whatever instrument she could find. In church basements, community centers, and eventually in the retirement home where she now lived. Music was her lifeline, her connection to the person she had once been. The piece reached its climactic moments. Margaret's entire body was involved now, her small frame containing a power that defied her age. The final cascading notes poured from the piano like a waterfall, building to a conclusion that used every key, every nuance of the instrument. As the last note faded into silence, Margaret kept her hands suspended above the keys, letting the music's echo fill the space. Then the theater exploded. The audience jumped to their feet as one, applause thundering through the building. People were crying openly, cheering, whistling. The standing ovation went on, showing no signs of stopping. Margaret stood slowly and turned to face the audience. She gave a small, graceful bow, the same bow she had perfected all those years ago in Prague. The host finally found his voice and rushed over to her. "Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Thompson," he shouted over the continued applause. Gone was the mocking tone, replaced by genuine awe. "Margaret, that was absolutely incredible. How is this possible? Who are you really?" Margaret smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm exactly who I said I was. I'm a 73-year-old woman who plays piano at a retirement home. But that performance, that was professional level. Concert hall quality. Music doesn't age," Margaret replied simply. "It stays with you no matter what life throws your way." The head judge, a famous music producer, stood up at the judges' table. "Mrs. Thompson, I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've rarely witnessed such mastery. Why aren't you performing professionally?" Margaret's smile was tinged with sadness. "Life had other plans for me. But I never stopped loving music. I never stopped playing." "Well, it's never too late," the judge declared. "I want to talk to you after the show. I have contacts at major symphony orchestras who need to hear you play." As the applause finally began to fade, the host asked, "What made you choose such a difficult piece? You must have known we weren't expecting this." Margaret looked directly at the camera, knowing her granddaughter Emily would be watching at home. "Sometimes people need to be reminded that age is just a number. That talent doesn't disappear when your hair turns gray. That every elderly person you see has a story, has dreams, has abilities you might never suspect." She turned to the young people in the front row who had been ready to laugh at her. "Never underestimate someone because of how they look or how old they are. You might miss something extraordinary." The show's social media feeds were already exploding. #Margaret Thompson was trending worldwide. Videos of her performance were being shared thousands of times per second. But Margaret didn't know about any of that yet. Backstage, the producer who had orchestrated the whole setup sat in his office, head in his hands. His assistant knocked and entered. "The phones are ringing off the hook," she said. "Every major news outlet wants to interview Margaret. Classical music labels are calling. This has become the biggest moment in the show's history." The producer looked up. "We brought her here to be laughed at," he admitted quietly. "Instead, she taught us all a lesson." Meanwhile, Margaret was surrounded by crew members, contestants, and audience members who had stayed behind. Everyone wanted to shake her hand to tell her how moved they were. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, pushed through the crowd with her mother. "Mrs. Thompson," she said shyly, "I take piano lessons but I wanted to quit because the other kids say it's boring. But after watching you..." Margaret knelt down to the girl's level, her knees protesting slightly. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie." "Well, Sophie, can I tell you a secret?" Margaret whispered conspiratorially. "Music is magic. It stays with you your whole life. It becomes your friend when you're lonely, your joy when you're happy, and your comfort when you're sad. Don't ever let anyone tell you it's boring." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Will you teach me that piece you played?" Margaret laughed. "That might take a few years of practice first. But I'll tell you what, if you keep practicing, one day you'll play it even better than I did tonight." Later, as Margaret finally prepared to leave the theater, she found the host waiting by the exit. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, looking genuinely remorseful, "I owe you an apology. We shouldn't have." Margaret patted his arm gently. "I know why I was brought here, young man. But sometimes life gives you chances to surprise people. To surprise yourself. I should thank you for that. You're remarkably forgiving. When you get to be my age, you learn that holding grudges is a waste of precious time." She smiled. "Besides, I got to play on a beautiful piano in front of thousands of people. At 73, that's not a bad evening's work." As Margaret's car pulled away from the theater, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young prodigy who became a refugee. The talented pianist who became a factory worker. The music teacher who became a grandmother. And now, perhaps, the viral sensation who would finally get her Carnegie Hall debut. Her phone, usually silent, was buzzing constantly with calls from Emily, from friends at the retirement home, from numbers she didn't recognize. Tomorrow would bring interviews, offers, and possibilities she had long ago stopped dreaming about. But tonight, Margaret just wanted to go home, make a cup of tea, and sit at her old upright piano. She would play the same Bach inventions she played every evening, not for an audience or cameras, but for the pure joy of making music. Because that's what real musicians do. They play not for fame or recognition, but because music is part of their soul. It doesn't matter if the audience is thousands in a concert hall or 3 friends in a retirement home. The music remains the same. Margaret Thompson's appearance on that talent show became legendary. Within days, her story had spread around the world. She did eventually perform at Carnegie Hall, fulfilling a dream deferred for over 50 years. She recorded an album that topped classical music charts. She became an advocate for senior citizens, reminding the world that talent and passion don't have expiration dates. But she also returned to her retirement home, where she continued to play for her friends every Wednesday afternoon. Because while the world had finally discovered Maria Margarita Petrovsky, she never forgot that she was also Margaret Thompson, neighbor, friend, and grandmother. The producers of the show learned their lesson too. They never again brought someone on to be mocked. Margaret's performance had shown them the danger of judging based on appearance, and the magic that can happen when you give someone a chance to surprise you. As for the piano at the retirement home, an anonymous donor replaced the old upright with a beautiful baby grand. The card simply read, "For Margaret, who reminded us all that it's never too late to shine." And every morning as the sun rose over the retirement home, residents would wake to the sound of Margaret playing. Not for cameras or audiences, but for the pure love of music. Because that's what real talent does. It endures, it perseveres, and sometimes when given the chance, it absolutely shocks the world.